Picture a man whose wealth is so staggering, so uh, utterly incomprehensible, that the sheer weight of his gold literally collapses the earth beneath him.
Right. He is swallowed alive by the very ground he built his empire on, dragging his entire estate down into the dirt.
Exactly. And, for thousands of years, that image has been sold to us as a horror movie miracle, like a divine lightning bolt punishing an arrogant billionaire.
A neat little morality tale you tell children, right? Just to teach them about the dangers of greed.
Yeah, which is a really convenient way to read it if you want to ignore the terrifying socioeconomic reality hiding just beneath the surface of that story.
Oh, absolutely. Because when you treat systemic collapse as magic, well, you absolve yourself of the responsibility to understand the engineering behind the failure.
And understanding that engineering is, it's our singular mission today on this deep dive. We are taking that ancient story, the story of a figure named Qarun, found in Surah Al-Qasas, verses 79 through 85.
And we are completely ripping out all the theological sentimentality.
We really are. We're going to examine excerpts from a brilliant, highly analytical lecture on this text delivered by the philosopher and scholar Ghulam Ahmed Perwez.
But, and this is key, we are looking at this strictly through the lens of master sociologists and systems engineers.
We're decoding the mechanics of civilizational survival versus inevitable catastrophic collapse. We want to find those brutal structural laws that dictate how economies that mistake hyper-display for stability will eventually cave in on themselves.
Because the mechanisms of failure, they don't actually change. I mean, the window dressing updates over time.
Yeah, the gold chariots become like algorithmic trading monopolies and offshore tax havens.
Exactly. But the physical laws of a top-heavy, hollowed-out society remain completely constant.
So for you, the listener, what makes this specific source text so fascinating is that it takes a total sledgehammer to the foundations of our modern political binaries.
It really does. It uses the story of Qarun to meticulously diagnose the fatal structural flaws in capitalism.
And then it turns around and uses the exact same engineering principles to dismantle the foundations of Soviet communism and the theories of Karl Marx.
Which is such a wild pivot. So as we walk through this today, keep in mind that we aren't here to pick a side or endorse any political ideology.
Absolutely not. We are purely mapping out this author's architectural critique of these systems. We're just looking at the blueprints.
So let's look at the starting condition of those blueprints. The text sets a very deliberate scene in verse 79.
Right, Qarun, this ultra-elite figure who basically represents the pinnacle of wealth concentration, he makes a public appearance.
Yeah, the verse says he paraded out before his people in his finery. The Arabic term used here is zinati.
Zinati. And the reaction from the masses is just instantaneous. They swoon over it.
They do.
Right.
They look at this display and say, if only we had the like of what Qarun has been given.
I mean, imagine standing in a crowd today watching a billionaire launch himself into orbit in a private rocket. Or, looking at a fleet of mega yachts parked in a harbor.
The visceral reaction is awe. You can't help it.
Right. But from a sociological standpoint, the source text is arguing that this parade is not just a guy showing off.
No, it serves a deeply calculated structural purpose. It is the deliberate manufacturing of public consent for massive systemic inequality.
So the elite in this model, they use the spectacle, the zinati, to essentially pacify the public.
Exactly. The primary function of the finery is to keep the masses in a state of perpetual envy rather than, well, a state of revolutionary awareness.
Think about the psychological mechanics at play when you look at that billionaire's rocket ship.
Right. If your immediate thought is, I wish I had that, or maybe if I grind hard enough, my startup will take off and I can buy a ticket.
Yeah, if you think that, you have bought into the system. You've internalized the logic of the extreme inequality.
You are looking up at the penthouse instead of looking down at the cracking foundation.
That's a great way to put it. The spectacle acts as this localized anesthetic. It stabilizes an incredibly top-heavy system.
By making the people at the bottom aspire to reach the very top, rather than questioning the architecture that placed them at the bottom to begin with.
So the finery is actually a defense mechanism for the hoarded wealth.
It really is. It creates what you could call a load-bearing fiction.
A load-bearing fiction. I like that. What is the fiction exactly?
The fiction is that the wealth is a blessing, that it's a sign of personal merit, and most importantly, that it's something attainable by anyone in the crowd if they just work hard enough.
And as long as the crowd believes that fiction, the whole system holds together.
Exactly. But then the text hits us with a massive, brutal reversal just 2 verses later.
Yeah.
Verse 81 states, "We cause the earth to swallow him in his house."
Wow. So the entire parade, the finery, the hoarded wealth, just gone.
Instantly gone.
Now, this is where I want to push back on the interpretation for a second. You said earlier we are reading this without the theological sentimentality.
Right, completely analytical.
But the phrasing, "we cause the earth to swallow him," inherently sounds like an external intervention. I mean, it sounds like a deity pulling a lever and opening a sinkhole because Qarun was just a bad guy.
It definitely reads that way on the surface.
So how does the source text frame this as sociology and not just a superstitious fairy tale about divine vengeance?
By tying it directly to the physical consequences of hoarding in a closed economic system. The text treats this swallowing of the earth as the materialization of a structural law.
Okay, walk me through that. How does hoarding cause the earth to open up?
Well, think about what hoarding extreme wealth actually entails. Wealth does not just materialize out of nowhere, right?
Right, it has to come from somewhere.
Exactly. It is extracted from the labor, the resources, and the vitality of a society.
Okay, I follow you.
So when that wealth is continuously extracted and piled infinitely high, outside the productive social order just sitting there as static finery, it inherently hollows out the foundation of the community.
Oh, I see. So the ground that displayed his wealth is literally what swallows it, because the foundation had to be mined and hollowed out to build the tower in the first place.
Precisely. The collapse is not an intervention from the outside. It is the mathematical result of the internal conditions.
Qarun dug out the earth beneath him to build his mountain of gold.
Yeah, when you remove the load-bearing pillars of a society, fair wages, social trust, circulation of resources, just to construct a shiny penthouse, gravity eventually takes over.
The sheer weight of the inequality breaks the system. It's just cause and effect.
And the text supports this by doing a really profound linguistic excavation of the Arabic vocabulary used in these verses.
Oh yeah, the author doesn't just give us a macro sociological theory. He traces it back to the absolute root definitions.
Which is fascinating. Let's break down those words, starting with that finery, the zina.
Usually zina is translated simply as adornment or decoration, right?
Yes, but in this specific socioeconomic context, the author frames zina as the ultimate performance of wealth, strictly as status.
Okay, so it's capital completely divorced from any societal utility.
Exactly. It has no function other than being looked at. It is dead capital.
So it's not a factory producing goods?
Yep. It's not infrastructure facilitating travel or trade. It's not agricultural investment feeding the public.
It is quite literally a solid gold chariot.
Right. Its only function is to signify power and maintain that hypnotic spectacle we discussed earlier.
So when a society's primary economic engine shifts from producing useful goods to producing zina, producing luxury status symbols for a tiny fraction of the population while the base struggles, that's a warning sign.
It is the absolute first indicator of structural rot.
Which brings us to the collapse itself. The phrase "kasafna bihi al-arda," we made the earth cave in over him.
Yeah, the root word here is kasaf.
I was actually struggling to visualize how this works systemically until I saw the three powerful analogies the author pulled from ancient Arabic usage.
They are so incredibly evocative, aren't they?
They completely altered how I view modern economic crashes. So walk us through the first one, the dried up well.
So, the ancient Arabs used the word kasaf to describe a well that had lost its water. Imagine a massive, beautifully constructed stone well in the center of a thriving village.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
The physical structure remains perfectly intact. The intricate masonry is still there. The heavy oak bucket is attached. The ropes are perfectly braided.
But the life-giving water at the bottom of the aquifer has completely vanished.
Exactly. So if you were just walking past it, it looks like a functioning piece of infrastructure.
But its functional reality is entirely dead. It's just a hollow shell.
Right. And when we apply this to a modern socioeconomic structure, a dried-up well economy is terrifyingly common.
How so? Like, what does that look like today?
Well, it looks like a functioning society from the outside. The stock market might be hitting all-time highs, the skyscrapers are gleaming, the corporate logos are everywhere.
The masonry of the economy looks pristine.
Exactly. But the actual resource keeping the society alive, the purchasing power of the middle class, the social mobility, the basic security of the average worker, has completely evaporated.
So the structure is dead, it just hasn't fallen over yet.
Precisely.
Man, that perfectly describes, like, hollowed out Rust Belt towns or those financialized corporations that look incredibly profitable on paper, but have entirely outsourced or automated their workforces.
The well looks beautiful, but nobody can actually drink from it.
Wow. Okay, what about the second analogy, the eclipsed moon?
So the word for a lunar eclipse is kusuf, deriving from the exact same root.
Right.
During an eclipse, the physical mass of the moon has not changed. The celestial body is still present in the sky. It hasn't been blown up or destroyed.
But its defining characteristic, its ability to reflect light and illuminate the night, is completely extinguished by the shadow of the Earth.
Exactly. So the physical form remains, but the energy is blocked out.
So in an economic sense, the institutions are still physically standing, the banks are there, the government buildings are there.
Yeah, but the vital energy of the society, the circulation of capital, is blacked out by the shadow of massive inequality. The system simply stops providing light.
That is such a stark image. And that leads directly to the third analogy, which brings this ancient text into a startlingly modern context.
Demonetized currency.
Yes. This is the one that really cemented the whole concept for me.
It is the ultimate socioeconomic metaphor for kasaf. Imagine you have a high-value, large-denomination banknote in your wallet.
Okay.
The physical object, the paper, the ink, the security threads, the watermark, it looks exactly the same today as it did yesterday.
Right. Nothing about the object itself has changed.
But overnight, a central government decrees that this specific currency is no longer a legal tender. It has been demonetized.
So in a single second, its socioeconomic power is reduced to zero.
Exactly. The physical paper didn't change at all, but the entire system of belief and value upholding it instantly collapsed.
Therefore, when the text states the earth caved in on Qarun, it is saying his entire socioeconomic system suffered this exact type of cuss-off.
His literal gold might still have been shiny, but the societal structure that gave it meaning, the system that allowed him to wield it as power, simply vanished.
He was left holding demonetized paper at the bottom of a dried-up well.
That is the perfect synthesis. Which brings us to the next vital piece of vocabulary, fiya.
Fiya. Because the text explicitly notes that when this collapse happened, Qarun had no faction, no group of solidarity to help him.
Right. And you have to ask, why does the wealthiest, most powerful man of the society have absolutely no one to help him when the ground starts shaking?
The sociological diagnosis here is that hoarding inherently isolates you.
It does. When you spend your life extracting wealth from the community to elevate yourself above them, you systematically sever your social bonds.
Qarun bought finery. He utterly failed to buy solidarity.
He probably assumed his wealth bought him loyalty. I mean, he had employees, he had servants, he had people begging for his favor.
But their loyalty was to the spectacle of the wealth, not to him, and certainly not to the system he represented.
You cannot build a durable support structure out of transactional envy. When the structural integrity of the system fails, those sycophants will not stand with you.
And we see proof of that instantly in verse 82. The very same crowd that was literally swooning over his wealth the day before, begging the universe to trade places with him, witnesses the collapse.
And their reaction is a total 180-degree pivot.
They say, had God not been gracious to us, he would have caved it in over us too.
It is the instantaneous evaporation of manufactured envy.
It's like a spell breaking. The second the load-bearing fiction fails, the public's illusion just shatters.
They don't mourn him. They don't try to save his gold.
They suddenly realize the penthouse they were admiring was actually a death trap.
They realize the structure was fundamentally hostile to their survival. As long as the spectacle holds, the masses tolerate the inequality.
Right, they endure the hardship because they believe the myth of trickle-down stability.
But the moment the kasaf occurs, the moment the currency is demonetized or the well runs dry, the public sees the architecture for what it really is.
And they are just intensely relieved they weren't standing on the top floor when gravity took over.
That serves as a glaring warning light for any modern society that measures its health by the net worth of its top 1%.
Totally. So if the Qarun model of hoarding and spectacle inevitably caves in on itself, what is the alternative?
Right. How do you build a system that doesn't trigger the kasaf?
Yeah. The source text does not leave us with a mere diagnosis of failure. It provides explicit, literal eligibility criteria for a durable order.
We find this in verse 83. It states that the durable future order, the lasting abode, is assigned only to those who seek neither superiority in the land nor corruption.
Let's look at the Arabic terms for those. Superiority is ulu, meaning domination, arrogance, or standing above others.
And corruption is facade, meaning imbalance, disorder, or decay.
Now let's pause on your phrasing there because you called them eligibility criteria. That is a massive paradigm shift from how these ancient texts are traditionally read.
Oh, so.
Normally, when a text says don't be arrogant and don't be corrupt, we process it as a gentle moral suggestion, like we read it as try to be a good person so you go to heaven.
Right, a spiritual guideline.
But the author is framing this as cold, hard engineering.
It is an engineering requirement for civilizational stability. It is not a polite request for better manners.
I love that framing.
Think of it this way. If you are hiring an architect to build a suspension bridge, and I tell you, do not use rusted steel and do not make one side exponentially heavier than the other, I am not giving you moral advice.
Right. You are stating the immutable laws of physics required for that bridge to not collapse into the river.
Exactly. Anti-domination, the anti-ulu, and anti-imbalance, the anti-facade, are the required building materials for a permanent society.
So if you build your economy on the premise that one class must dominate another, you are basically building your bridge with rusted steel.
Precisely. And this is the pivot point where the author of our source test does something incredibly ambitious and intellectually rigorous.
He takes this exact criteria, the engineering requirement of anti-domination and anti-imbalance, and uses it to launch a massive sociological critique of the two dominant economic systems of modern history.
Capitalism and communism.
Okay, let's really dive into this. And again, reminding you, the listener, we are looking at this purely analytically.
We aren't making political endorsements. We are just testing both systems against the structural requirements of verse 83.
So let's start with the capitalist flaw. How does the text map the story of Qarun onto a critique of modern capitalism?
It points directly to the ideological mindset required to justify hoarding, which is captured perfectly in verse 78.
What happens in that verse?
When Qarun's people questioned his massive accumulation of wealth, his response was, I was given this because of the knowledge I possess.
Oh, wow. I am a self-made man.
Exactly. I earned it. My intellect, my hustle, my unique genius created this value.
So the text identifies this as the fundamental, fatal delusion of the hoarding class.
Yes. It is the billionaire who stands at the apex of a mountain of societal infrastructure.
Yeah.
Publicly funded roads that transport his goods, publicly educated workforces that staff his factories.
Government-funded defense networks that invented the internet his algorithms run on, legal systems that protect his private property.
Right. And he looks down on all of that and claims that his wealth is solely the product of his individual merit.
It's the arrogance of standing on the 80th floor of a skyscraper and claiming you levitated there, completely denying the existence of the 79 floors of steel and concrete beneath you, holding you up.
And by denying the societal infrastructure, by claiming, my knowledge earned it, the capitalist structurally justifies refusing to circulate the wealth back into the system.
It is mine. I owe the foundation nothing.
The text argues that this specific mindset is the ultimate manifestation of Ulu domination and superiority.
Because you extract from the foundation to build your floor and you refuse to reinforce the lower levels.
Exactly. You are mathematically guaranteeing the eventual cave-in because you are starving the roots of the system that sustains you.
So that covers the systemic flaw of capitalism, according to the text. But then the author turns his analytical lens toward communism, specifically referencing Karl Marx and his magnum opus, Das Kapital.
And the critique here is intensely nuanced because the text does not just dismiss Marx out of hand. It actually gives him credit for a crucial realization.
Yeah, the author acknowledges that Marx was a brilliant socioeconomic diagnostician.
He was. Marx looked at the capitalist system of the 19th century and correctly identified the disease.
He saw the extreme hoarding, he saw the alienation and exploitation of the wage earner.
He saw the systemic imbalance, the facade. He looked at the bridge and correctly identified that the steel was rusting and the weight distribution was fatally flawed.
Marx essentially pointed at the capitalist structure and said, this is going to undergo Qasas. The earth is going to swallow this.
And historically, in many places, he was right. The pressures ruptured.
So if Marx correctly identified the disease of imbalance, where does the text say his proposed system failed?
The diagnosis was correct, but the prescription was structurally deficient. The system failed because it merely destroyed the old house without laying a permanent positive foundation for a new one.
To articulate this, the author leans heavily on the philosopher Muhammad Iqbal's profound critique of communism.
Right. Iqbal characterized the entire communist movement as a law.
La, meaning no in Arabic. Negation.
It was a movement defined entirely by what it was destroying. It was the negation of the old gods, the negation of the Tsar, the negation of the capitalist lords, the negation of private property.
It was an incredibly powerful wrecking ball.
But a wrecking ball isn't an architectural plan. Just screaming no at a broken system doesn't automatically build a durable bridge in its place.
And that is exactly Iqbal's point. He argued that communism lacked an absolute positive standard.
In his poetic terms, he said it lacked a Moses or a Jesus, meaning it lacked a transcendent, unchanging set of values to anchor the new society.
It tore down the authoritarian monarch, but what did it replace it with? Just an authoritarian state.
It destroyed the old domination, the Ulu, only to construct a new, bureaucratized form of domination.
Which leads directly into the source text's brilliant critique of the wage trap in Soviet-style socialism. I want to spend some time on this because it exposes the mechanical failure of state-run economies.
Yeah, it's a critical point.
How did the wage trap survive the revolution?
Because the revolution didn't change the foundational nature of human labor. It merely changed the management.
So the worker was still entirely alienated from their labor.
Exactly. The text argues that Soviet-style systems simply replaced the private capitalist with the state bureaucracy.
They were still essentially just a cog in a massive machine working for a wage dictated by a centralized power rather than truly sharing in the value they created.
The state became the new Qarun.
The state became the new Qarun. Man, that is perfectly stated.
Now, true equality, as defined by the underlying philosophy of this source text, requires a totally different economic mechanism.
What does that mechanism look like?
It requires a system where individuals contribute according to their maximum capacity, but take from the system only according to their actual need, leaving the surplus for the society.
Okay, let me stop you right there, because that is where the cynic in me, and likely in the listener, starts flashing red warning lights.
I get it. It sounds utopian.
Contributing by capacity and taking only by need sounds beautiful on paper. But how do you get a brilliant surgeon or a master engineer to willingly work 60-hour weeks and then voluntarily take home only what their family strictly needs?
Especially when that allows the massive surplus value they generated to be distributed to someone who perhaps cannot work at all.
Exactly. That goes against every instinct of self-preservation and accumulation we see in human history.
And that skepticism is exactly why the text argues that a purely materialistic system like Soviet communism was doomed to fail.
Okay, so how does the text solve that problem?
Well, to achieve that level of voluntary redistribution, to actually enact from each according to ability to each according to need, requires a massive fundamental psychological shift within the population.
A psychological shift.
Yes. It requires people to actually care about the unseen members of their society on a profound, almost sacred level.
It requires a level of solidarity, a true faya that transcends basic material transactions.
Exactly. It requires an absolute conviction in a higher law, a higher standard of human solidarity that says the health of the collective is intrinsically tied to your own spiritual and social survival.
But a purely materialistic, atheistic system cannot organically incentivize that psychological shift.
No, it can't. If the universe is composed strictly of matter, and there is no higher moral architecture, no permanent law beyond state decrees, why shouldn't the powerful engineer demand 10 times more resources than the weak laborer?
The logic of materialism actually justifies hoarding. If we are all just biological machines competing for finite resources, empathy is basically a rounding error.
So, when Marx's system realized it could not organically change the human heart to voluntarily share the surplus, it had to rely on the only tool it had left.
Force.
Exactly. It had to force them to share through the apparatus of an authoritarian state. It had to use violence, secret police, and gulags to maintain the economic balance.
And the moment you introduce state violence and authoritarian control to manage the economy, you have reintroduced Ulu.
You have reintroduced domination. You have swapped one form of imbalance for another.
The capitalist imbalance was driven by private wealth, and the communist imbalance was driven by state power.
But both violated the engineering requirement of verse 83. They both built their societies on domination.
And because they used rusted steel, the structural laws of the universe guarantee that both will eventually undergo Qasas. They will both cave in.
This analysis is so incredibly airtight. It strips away all the political tribalism and just looks at the math of human organization.
So let's unpack the actual mechanism that makes these systems collapse. Because it's not arbitrary, right?
Wait, it's highly predictable.
The text introduces a concept that acts as the mathematical engine of this whole theory, mukafat AMO.
Mukafat AMO, the law of requital.
What does the law of requital actually look like in practice?
In its simplest form, it means cause inevitably meets effect. It is the principle that every single action, policy, and structural design in a society has a mathematically precise consequence.
So in the context of this deep dive, Qarun's catastrophic end is not a sudden, angry punishment from a highly emotional deity.
It is the precise, unavoidable output of his initial input.
If you input extraction without circulation and you input status without solidarity, the output equals a systemic cave-in.
It is literally an equation. If your socioeconomic input is, I earned it myself and owe nothing to the whole, the direct proportional output is that you have no faction, no fiat to brace the walls when the structural stress becomes too much.
The law of requital is essentially sociological karma, but completely stripped of the mysticism. It operates with the unfeeling precision of thermodynamics.
And this equation forces us to confront a concept that represents perhaps the largest paradigm shift in the entire source text.
The concept of qiyamah.
Yes. Now, traditionally, if you hear the Arabic word qiyamah, you immediately associate it with the Day of Judgment.
Right. You think of the end of the universe, a purely post-death apocalyptic event where the dead rise and everyone stands before God in the afterlife.
But the sociological lens of this text does something radically different with this word. It reclaims the literal linguistic root of the word.
The word qiyamah derives from the root qum, and qum simply means to stand up.
To stand up. Not the stars falling from the sky, not the end of time, just standing up.
Right. Well, Orthodox theology pushes this concept entirely into the realm of the afterlife to keep the masses docile in this life. This analytical reading argues something else entirely.
It argues that qiyamah, this standing up, frequently refers to social revolutions, reckonings, and systemic collapses in this world.
That is staggering. So it's not about waiting until you die to see justice served.
No. Qiyamah is the moment the oppressed class finally stands up and demands an accounting. Right here, right now.
It is the moment the internal pressures of a fractured society finally rupture the surface.
The text describes the collapse of past civilizations not as sudden acts of magic, but as the result of a long, unseen rot.
And it uses another loaded term here, right? Jahannam.
Yes, Jahannam. Traditionally translated as hell, the text frames it as an internal, invisible fire consuming the society from within.
I picture a coal seam fire, like those underground fires in places like Centralia, Pennsylvania, that burn beneath the surface for decades.
That's a great visual.
If you are just walking around on the grass, you don't see the flames, the surface looks perfectly normal.
But the fire is slowly hollowing out the earth underneath your feet, turning the rack to ash.
Until one day, without warning, the ground just opens up and swallows a car.
That is the perfect analogy for the law of requital at work. The elites, the Qaruns of the world, are blinded by the intoxication of wealth.
They are sitting in their penthouses, obsessing over their Zanatihi, their stock portfolios, and their finery.
Completely oblivious to the heat building up in the basement of their own building.
They don't feel the structural integrity failing.
They don't see the unseen rot of the middle class hollowing out, or the anger brewing in the marginalized sectors, because the system is intentionally designed to keep them isolated from it.
The gated communities keep the smoke out.
Exactly. But the law of requital is constantly running the math in the background. The pressure builds, the temperature rises, and eventually the equation balances itself.
The masses stand up, quom the qiyamah occurs, and the volcano erupts.
And when that eruption finally happens, the text provides this incredibly dramatic, almost cinematic imagery of the elite's reaction.
Yeah, when the systemic collapse begins, the people at the top, the hoarders, realize the ground is giving way.
Their instinct is to flee. They try to run away from the consequences.
They head for the private jets and the luxury bunkers, but the law of requital, the voice of history itself, calls out to them in the midst of the chaos. What does it say?
The verse issues a chilling command. It says, "Do not flee. Return to the luxuries in which you lived, so you may be questioned."
Return to the luxuries, so you may be questioned. That is haunting.
It is the universe saying you cannot hop on a jet and fly away from the economy you broke.
You cannot outrun the collapse of the infrastructure you deliberately hollowed out.
The text is making a profound point about the geography of accountability. The reckoning must happen at the site of the exploitation.
You extracted your massive wealth from this specific society. You built your luxury on the backs of this specific workforce in this specific city.
And when the law of requital balances the ledger, you must face the accounting right there, surrounded by the evidence.
The luxury itself is the evidence of the crime. The mega yacht, The massive estate that is the physical proof of the facade, the imbalance you injected into the system.
You are imprisoned by your own finery.
And that is the ultimate fatal flaw of the isolated elite mindset. They truly believe their wealth allows them to secede from the society they inhabit.
They believe their money makes them immune to the laws of societal physics.
But the law of requital is universal. When the earth caves in, it does not care how expensive the imported Italian floor tiles in the penthouse are.
Gravity applies to everyone.
Man, we have covered a truly massive amount of ground here. We've gone from ancient Arabic root words to the failures of Soviet state capitalism to the physics of underground fires.
It's a lot to take in. Let's pull all these threads together into a synthesis.
Yeah, because what the author of this source text is really demanding of us is to recognize the tension between what is permanent and what merely changes its appearance.
The permanent principle is the structural law we've been circling this entire time. Hoarded wealth, no matter how dazzling its display, no matter what economic theory is used to justify it, always sits on a foundation it is actively destroyed.
That is the unchanging verdict of the text. A system built on ulu domination and facade imbalance will eventually face collapse.
The law of requital doesn't care about the era. The math is permanent.
But the change is the window dressing. The specific nature of the finery updates across centuries.
We transition from Qarun's literal mountains of gold coins and legions of slaves to the Gilded Age robber barons with their railroad monopolies and steel trusts.
All the way to modern algorithmic tech monopolies, speculative crypto fortunes, and global supply chains that hide the exploited labor overseas.
The aesthetic of the Xena changes wildly, but the mechanics of isolated accumulation causing societal collapse remain a constant.
Qarun's hole in the ground is not a localized historical event. It is the ultimate, guaranteed verdict on any economy that mistakes temporary, glittering display for long-term structural stability.
Which brings us back to a deeply practical question.
What's that?
If we look around at our current global economic system, and we see the extreme concentration of wealth, the hollowing out of the working class, the reliance on debt.
If we recognize that our current system is structurally unsound and heading toward a Qasas event, how do we shift to a durable model without causing a total catastrophic collapse?
Right. How do we avoid the Marxist mistake of just violently blowing up the old house without a new one to live in? Nobody wants to live in the rubble.
It is the most difficult engineering challenge a society can face.
But the author of our source text provides a brilliant, highly pragmatic engineering analogy for this transition.
He says we must view society like an incredibly old, rusted railway bridge spanning a massive chasm.
Okay, I can picture it. The steel is corroded, the rivets are popping, it's shaking violently under the weight of the traffic. It is a death trap.
It desperately needs to be replaced. But here's the catch. There are trains running over this bridge constantly.
Human society, the supply chains, the hospitals, the food distribution networks, they are currently running on this rusted bridge.
You cannot simply place dynamite on the old bridge and blow it up in the name of revolution.
That is the fatal flaw of violent, unanchored uprisings. They destroy the corrupt structure while the train is still on it, resulting in mass casualties, starvation, and chaos.
You end up with the French Revolution's reign of terror, or the catastrophic famines of the Soviet leap forward.
So if you can't blow it up, and you can't just leave it alone to eventually collapse on its own, what is the structural engineering solution?
You must meticulously, quietly, and persistently build the new, durable structure underneath the old one.
You assemble the new steel pillars, you pour the deep concrete footings, you lay the new tracks, all while the old rusted bridge is still functioning above you.
And you design and build this new foundation based entirely on the principles of Verse 83 anti-domination, ulu, and anti-imbalance facade.
You build alternative economic models, cooperative networks, mutual aid systems, and new paradigms of value.
You essentially build the scaffolding of the future inside the shell of the present.
Exactly. And only when the new structure is completely sound, only when it is rigorously tested and capable of bearing the full load of society, do you begin the process of dismantling the old bridge.
So that society seamlessly transitions onto the new foundation. The train barely even registers the bump.
The old extractive system is phased out, and the society continues moving forward, but now it is supported by an architecture designed for permanence, not extraction.
This is not an overnight process. It requires immense patience. It requires deep, localized structural engineering.
And most importantly, it requires an absolute unyielding commitment to building something positive, rather than just indulging in the catharsis of destroying the negative.
That is an incredibly powerful, grounded way to look at social change. It cures you of the desire for a chaotic revolution, but it also cures you of the apathy of accepting the broken system.
It assigns you a job, go build the new pillars.
Well, we have truly unpacked a masterclass today. We started by looking at a crowd of people swooning over the glittering myth of the blessed hoarder, the billionaire everyone is conditioned to envy.
And we methodically stripped that myth down to the raw, unfeeling mechanics of civilizational design.
We've seen how isolated wealth destroys the very social solidarity needed to survive a crisis.
We've learned how the linguistic roots of ancient Arabic words reveal terrifying modern truths, like the economy of the dried-up well and the instantaneous shock of a demonetized currency.
And we've seen how the mathematical certainty of the law of requital guarantees that any top-heavy system built on domination will eventually cave in on itself.
We have mapped out the undeniable physics of inequality.
We absolutely have. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a thought experiment to mull over as you go about your day.
Think back to our very first metaphor, the concept of looking at a blueprint to find the load-bearing walls, or looking at the structural integrity of a building.
Think deeply about the specific metrics we are told to use to measure the health of our society today. We cheer when the gross domestic product goes up. We celebrate when the stock market hits all-time historic highs.
We literally read magazines that rank the sheer concentration of wealth at the very top, treating the richest among us as the ultimate winners of the human game. We look at their finery and we applaud.
But if the story of Qarun and the law of requital prove that extreme display is not a sign of health, but is actually the primary glaring symptom of impending structural failure,
What unseen cracks in our own foundation are we currently celebrating as solid ground?